Hi, welcome to session 3 of the fifth topic of the semester dealing with the First World War. Okay, this is World War I from 1914 to 1918. So far, we have covered a great deal of this topic's material dealing with the causes, dealing with the origins of World War I. Rooted in European history, European politics, European economics. So we spent about 2 sessions discussing as fully as possible the origins and the causes of the First World War. That is not just going to serve us to understand the outbreak of World War I, but also to understand the 20th century in general. We're moving into the 20th century, and there will be great events taking place in this century, such as, for example, the First World War, and of course the Second World War as well. And we know the Second World War was far more catastrophic. Again, once we move into the Second World War, we're going to be looking at the Holocaust as well. So again, it will be far more destructive, more catastrophic. And so some of the issues that we have discussed so far in the first and second sessions are going to serve us to understand World War I and also World War II, and to a certain degree also the Cold War as well. Understanding the coming of the Cold War, this is something, again, that we're going to assess in a much, much later discussion in a future topic towards the end of the semester. Okay, that is also looking at the 20th century as well, looking at 20th century, politics. Again, we're going to look at again the struggle between ideologies like capitalism, communism, and the like. And again, so this discussion again of the first and second sessions, dealing with the origins, the causes of the First World War, are going to be very, very useful for understanding the future of the course. Okay, so now we're ready to move forward in this discussion, looking at now U.S. entry into the Great War. We're going to look at the causes, the factors that led the United States to come into the war. That, again, so far we have understood that this was primarily a European conflict. This is a struggle between European powers. They're imperial powers, but they're also industrial powers, industrial nations that are also competing for resources, raw materials, markets as well. Strategic locations for international trade, for example, ports such as the region of the Balkans in Eastern Europe. And they're competing for also ethnic dominance, ethnic supremacy, if you will, this idea of ethnic nationalism that we have explored quite extensively in the first topic. So this is a European struggle that is going to engulf other nations like the United States by 1917. And of course, this is going to be now a global conflict. Again, it's not just going to be European centered, only fought among Europeans, but this is going to involve, of course, other nations and other peoples from around the world. So now let us turn our attention to our outline here to look at now the second part, again, of this topic, dealing with U.S. entry in the Great War. Okay, so it is here now that we have to now look at the factors, the reasons why the United States is going to become involved in the Great War, because this is a U.S. history course, so we must look at, again, now U.S. participation in the Great War. And at the end of the session, we're going to look at the outcome of the war, the final and the ending of the war and the outcomes. Okay, so let us look now at U.S. entry in the Great War, and there will be a series of factors, again, that are going to influence the decision of the United States to become involved. Okay, so let's look at some of those factors again, one by one. So, number one is the actions, the policies of the nation of Germany that is going to create the atmosphere for tensions with the United States. It was actually Germany that is creating, of course, the atmosphere for diplomatic tensions. And of course, there will be a diplomatic rupture with the United States, leading the United States to finally, again, become involved on the side of the Allies, by the way. So it is, again, Germany that is initiating a series of policies, starting, number one, with, again, inside of Europe itself. And that is that the nation of Germany is not really abiding by certain treaties, if you will, that were previously signed, prior to 1914 by the European nations who did not want to participate in the alliance system that we discussed, again, in the second topic. So they don't want to get involved in alliances. There's some nations that actually don't want to even participate in the conflict if there's going to be one, and they proclaim, a posture, a status of neutrality. Okay, so they declared themselves to be neutral. They were not going to participate in any of the sides if there was going to be a war. So again, some nations actually voiced their opinions, their position, and there were certain agreements, certain treaties that were signed in Europe in order to pretty much establish in paper, that certain nations were to remain neutral. Okay, so one of those nations was the nation of Belgium, which was actually in neighbors with both Germany and France. North of France, we're going to see this little country called Belgium that is also, again, the neighbor of Germany. That is clearly, again, this is a country in the middle of two opposing powers that is very clearly stating that they were not going to become involved. Okay, they're neutral. This is a neutral country. And it was to remain so for most of, again, World War I. But what the Germans realize is at the very outset of the war, when the war breaks out, is that Belgium happens to be located in a geographical position that was advantageous for Germany to actually launch an invasion into France. Okay, because when you look at the map itself, here again, this is France, this is Germany. Here to the east, to the west, there's France, and here in the middle again is Belgium. So the French, for many, many years before 1914, have anticipated a German invasion into France. And the most obvious location for that invasion was the obvious German-French border. Again, much more to the south. And so the French, for many, many years, were involved in building a series of forts, military garrisons, stationing troops there, and trying to pretty much shield their border, because this is the obvious location from which the Germans were simply going to come in if there was going to be a war. So they were just preparing, if you will, for a German attack and German invasion by pretty much fortifying their settlements, their towns there, and stationing troops. And they were trying to pretty much protect France, particularly protect the city of Paris. The city of Paris is the capital of France. That if it's taken, by the Germans, this will entail the fall of France. Okay, all you need to do is pretty much capture the capital again in order for the nation to fall. And so that's exactly what the French were anticipating. And so the Germans understood that because the French were awaiting the Germans to come in through this location, which was obvious, of course, They wanted to launch an invasion into France to capture Paris from a location that the French were not anticipating, and that is from the northern border between Belgium and France. So that would entail, of course, crossing through Belgium, through the country of Belgium, using the country of Belgium as a launching pad, if you will, to launch an invasion, because the French troops were not there. I mean, there were very little, troops there. The vast majority of the French army is in the south, so they said, well, this is going to be like a surprise invasion. They're not going to expect us here, and so we can easily take Paris. This is a strategy that a German general suggested, and it was actually approved by the leadership in Germany. The General von Schieven. Again, he actually presented this strategy, this called the von Schieven Plan, and that entailed moving the German forces through Belgium, and with that, of course, occupying Belgium. Belgium will remain in occupation for most of World War One by the Germans, because they were using this country to move troops, supplies, and invade France. And the idea is that they just wanted to capture Paris as quickly as possible. And so they went, ahead with this plan. And we're going to see that Belgium, in the very initial months of World War One, was invaded by the Germans. Of course, this was a neutral, country, and now it's occupied. And so the idea here is that what is at stake is that Germany was not abiding again by neutrality agreements, neutrality pacts. It was simply disregarding them and just, moving forward with their strategies by pretty much, occupying countries, that were declared neutrality. So this is the first action, the first policy of Germany, okay, that is going to reveal that the Germans were not going to follow, again, agreements or pacts or accords or, treaties, etc. But particularly, they were not going to respect neutrality, the neutrality of certain nations, that is to say. And we see that, again, very evident with the country of Belgium. So again, this is the region. Once again, this is the region that is going to be now occupied by the Germans. And the Germans, of course, are going to move their forces into France. They're not going to be able to reach Paris, by the way, because, there was this quick mobilization of the French forces to the north, and there's going to be trenches. We talk about the trench warfare. Trenches were built, again, on that Belgian border along that line in order to detain, to stop the German advance. So most of the war will be fought in the northern border of France. Trenches were built in order to halt, again, the German army. And the French were assisted, of course, by the British. British and French forces were fighting together side by side to stop the Germans from reaching Paris. So at this point, what is also revealing is that the peoples of Belgium are complaining not only about the violation of neutrality by Germany, but they're also complaining about the treatment of the German troops to the people of Belgium that were mistreated. They were committing atrocities, the German soldiers, in many cases, and those were reported, of course, in the news. In European news are reported, but also in the United States. So public opinion very early on is going to be shifting, in a way that Germany is not going to be endorsed, if you will, by the nations of the world because of the atrocities, again, they're committing in Belgium. So public opinion is turning against Germany. Okay. And this is when we hear, for example, news, being broadcasted about the Germans being labeled as the Huns. This is the nickname that the Germans were known for during World War One. They were known as the Huns. The Huns are coming. The Huns are coming. Man, the Germans, of course, are coming. This is, how soldiers in the battlefield refer to the Germans, but also pretty much all over the world. People began to refer to the Germans as the Huns, and of course, this is a very negative, this is a negative term that means barbarian. Okay, the Huns were a barbaric tribe back in the 4th and 5th century AD that actually invaded Europe. Again, the Huns came from the east. There were eastern tribes, there were barbaric tribes that invaded Europe from the east, and they pillaged settlements, they pillaged the agricultural fields, slaughter animals, burned, entire towns to the ground again. So it really left a scar, a trauma in the European consciousness, that they never forgot about the Huns, those barbaric tribes that once upon a time were trying to destroy European civilization. They said, they were not necessarily close in destroying the European civilization, but there was a fear back then that they could indeed destroy a great portion of European civilization. So here we are going to also, hear about the Germans trying to destroy civilization, because they were barbarics. In other words, that they were invading innocent countries like Belgium, and they were committing atrocities against the population and the like. And so this created a very negative image, again, around the world about Germany and the Germans, that they're not going to be favored, if you will, by many peoples around the world. Of course, the United States is going to be, the American people are also going to develop a kind of negative image, of course, of Germany as well, even though the United States is not involved. Again, in this time in the war, is going to develop, some negative concepts. There were, even, like cartoons, if you will, in terms of people displaying posters, etc., caricatures, I meant, about, for example, the German emperor. Okay, so here, what you see here is the German emperor, Wilhelm II, being displayed as a brute, as a savage, like an animal, if you will, that was destroying civilization in his wake, in his path. And he was taking this innocent country, Belgium, along with him. Again, this is the lady represents, actually the country of Belgium, and he is pretty much destroying cultures everywhere they go. Again, that was the imagery that people were getting from newspapers, etc. That were very, very influential in shaping people's ideas and people's concepts about the war. And very early on, and of course, Germany is being seen here, is being portrayed as the aggressor, so to speak. Okay, so instead of Germany being, the Germans see themselves, of course, as the most advanced technologically, the most advanced scientifically, economically, etc. They coming from a race of Superman or gods, like the Aryans that we talked about. So this is the reverse concept again. So just at the very time when the Germans present themselves as superior, you will, the most advanced, the most godly race, more pure, etc. This image really downgrades again the Germans down to the animal level. Again, to the animal kingdom, if you will. So this is a reversal, again, of that self-image that is so important in Germany, again, of themselves, again, descending from the Aryans. Okay, so again, this is very important, okay, because this is, shaping public opinion, particularly in the United States. Now, of course, German actions, policies are going to also affect the United States. And again, there's going to be tensions, there's going to be direct, conflict and aggression against Americans, of course, American merchants particularly, that were trading, with Great Britain and with France as well. So yes, the policies that Germany implemented in Europe that affected Belgium, they're also going to affect the United States, of course. So the United States was one of the nations that also proclaimed neutrality before the war. And this is, again, a position. Neutrality has been a position of the United States for, since its birth as an independent nation. The United States had pretty much stayed neutral in many of the European conflicts, particularly European conflicts. The United States was just neutral. There have been so many conflicts in Europe ever since the United States was formed. There were wars fought in Europe, etc., by different parties and nations, etc. Some lasted a few years, others more. But the United States always remained neutral because this had been the kind of traditional position in terms of U.S. foreign policy. It was that non-involvement, in other words, in European affairs, okay, particularly European affairs. So this really goes back again, to President James Monroe in 1824. In 1824, President James Monroe pretty much declared, a position of neutrality. The United States was not going to get involved in European affairs. It's called the Monroe Doctrine, by the way, the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine was the doctrine of most U.S. presidents of the 19th century, non-involvement in Europe, of course. And there was also this attitude of isolationism as well that was also prevalent in the United States. That this is an attitude really goes back even before the creation of the United States, back to the times of the colonial period. This is an attitude that developed in the colonies, particularly when the colonists, the British colonists, this is when the United States was part of Great Britain. There were a series of 13 colonies. They just felt that in many cases, again, that many of the peoples that came into the United States back in the colonial period is that they were really escaping the climate, the turmoil, the tension, the persecution back in Europe. That many of the peoples that came to the colonies, that immigrated to the colonies, the European immigrants that settled in North America, that they were just so disillusioned, again, with European society, with European politics, with religious conflicts, Protestants and Catholics, and they just saw Europe to be so much a troublesome society that they just wanted to be left alone. So they just wanted to isolate themselves, in other words, that they wanted to come to North America to practice their religion in freedom, to not be so much in trouble, by the politics of Europe, and so much affected by the wars fought in Europe that affected peasants, affected virtually everybody. So again, isolationism is really an attitude. Again, that goes back even before the creation of the United States, back in the colonies. So when the United States was formed and gained independence from Great Britain, again, this isolationism, this attitude pretty much persisted in the politics of almost every president, from Washington all the way to this time, that again, Americans just felt that they didn't really wanted to get involved again in the conflicts of the world. They wanted to be pretty much isolated, going about their daily lives, etc., unaffected by what was going on, particularly in Europe, and most especially in Europe. So again, neutrality, American neutrality and isolationism had been pretty much the tradition, again, of U.S. policy when it comes to foreign policy. How the United States was interacting with the rest of the world is that it was a neutral nation. It was isolated as well. However, okay, so when the First World War breaks out in 1914, those traditional positions were reevaluated. Okay, it doesn't mean that people suddenly in the United States are going to change their minds overnight and suddenly wanting to get involved in Europe. That's not the case. But what was really at stake in Europe, okay, in this conflict, was that you cannot totally remain totally isolated and neutral in this conflict, because what was at stake is that Germany, again, the alliance of Germany with Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, represented a bloc. Again, this party, this alliance, represented a bloc that actually represented monarchy. Okay, those were imperial systems that had not yet developed any democratic institutions. Okay, so they had no systems of political representation. People who were not represented in the state. There were no systems of free elections, for example, that people could elect their leaders, etc. Again, all of that was not existent. Those were imperial systems governed by emperors, okay, that served for life, etc. So those were not democratic, okay, systems. This is the bloc, again, that Germany represented. And the other bloc, the allies, France, Great Britain, at least, again, those two, France and Great Britain, represented the democracies, again, of Europe. They also allied themselves with Russia, and Russia was not really a democracy. It was still an imperial system. It was an empire. It was ruled by an emperor, but it was beginning to create the very first systems of representation. We see around the years prior to the outbreak of World War I, the creation in Russia of a parliament, again, what we call a Congress, for example. It was not that powerful, but we see the very first steps in Russia moving towards something like a parliamentary system, even though, the emperor was, still the ruler, the absolute ruler of the land. So Russia is not really a democracy, okay? But Great Britain and France are the democracies. So what this means is that if Germany and the alliance, again, of the Central Powers, as they're called, will win, this war, this is going to be the end of democracy in Europe, okay? Because they're going to defeat the leading democracies of Europe, France and Great Britain. And so what would that mean then for the future of Europe and the future of the world as well, when you have the monarchies pretty much dominating the entire European continent? So again, this is not something that could be ignored that easily, and simply people just, turning away from this conflict and saying, oh, well, this is just another European conflict, and let it be. So for that reason, the United States, even though it's not getting involved directly, is going to send aid to Great Britain in order to, again, help the British not surrender, in other words, so they can continue, resisting the Germans, territorial expansion, territorial ambitions. They're pretty much, invading Belgium, they're invading France. They're also involved in the East, fighting Russia. So the United States is beginning to send aid again to Great Britain. Monetary aid, $3.5 billion are going to be given to the British. And also, of course, supplies as well, things like food, for example, clothing, there's beef, sand, grain, and the like, again, to sustain the British cause, to help the British cause. So at the same time that this is taking place, the British implemented very early on in 1914 a policy of their own that was geared to actually deprive the Germans from needed vital supplies. Okay, the Germans needed, of course, also food, particularly food, at this time to sustain the troops, to sustain their own population. Germany is not totally 100% self-sufficient when it comes to food production. They must also import certain foodstuffs from overseas in order to sustain their cities, to sustain even their troops. Now, there's going to be also the great need for foodstuffs, again, to sustain their troops. So so again, in order to deprive the Germans from those needed vital resources, the British blockaded their main entry port, their main entry point, their main international ports, again, from which they were actually importing food in the past. So they're going to deprive the Germans from actually receiving those materials, and also war materials that they're going to need as well to carry on the war effort. So the British blockaded, you can see this blockaded here. What the naval blockade is simply there's going to be British ships pretty much patrolling, again, this region, stationed there to prevent ships coming from other countries, it didn't matter which country, to prevent them from actually reaching the German ports in order to bring any cargo in. Again, so this policy, as we'll see, is going to be very successful, because this is going to be central for the surrender of Germany at the end. We're going to get there again in just a few moments. But needless to say, again, this policy was actually very strategic, in actually creating the conditions for the Germans to consider surrender, because they're not going to have the needed materials. They're blockaded. So it is out of desperation, therefore, that Germany is going to embark upon a very aggressive course of action, very aggressive policies towards the British and the French. They're responding in the same manner. What the Germans are going to do, the Germans are going to do is that they're going to also blockade, the French and British ports. So Germany is now going to become very aggressive as well in trying to deprive their rivals from receiving any materials as well, whether it's food or war supplies, etc. It didn't matter. So the Germans are pretty much responding in a similar manner, but in this process, as we'll see, the Germans are going to affect, of course, nations that were trading with the French and the British, that were neutral. And most of the ships that are going to be affected, most of the merchant ships, the cargo ships that will be affected here are going to be American, of course, because the United States was sending aid to Great Britain, particularly Great Britain. And because he was sending aid, the Germans are going to actually use a new technology, a new naval technology, the submarine. Again, the submarine is now going to be used here during World War I in a very significant way by the Germans. Again, Germany is going to use the submarines in order to also blockade the British ports, the French ports, in order to deprive their rivals from actually receiving any war supplies, any aid, period. Didn't matter from which country, again, was sending the aid. Okay, it didn't matter whether those were enemy ships or there were neutral, there were civilian, didn't matter. So this is what is called unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare. So what is unrestricted submarine warfare? Is that there's no restrictions, there's no rules. The German submarines were simply sinking any ship that was in the area, en route towards a French port or a British port. Didn't matter. So they were not, following protocols. They were not following the traditional norms of stopping the ship and maybe, looking at the ship as what the ship was carrying, or perhaps even just the way it was done in the past is that, in many cases, nations just stole the cargo, and that's the way it was. Again, warfare was conducted in the past. It was called, of course, piracy. So they were not even using that option, and called piracy, stealing the cargo from the other side or from a neutral ship, from a neutral country that was sending aid to a country, etc. They were simply sinking it, okay, altogether. So no questions asked. Again, this is what unrestricted submarine warfare, and they were just treating any ship in the area as enemy, pretty much. Again, so once again, they're going to surround the British Isles with submarines, and they're going to also patrol, surround the French ports with submarines, and they were simply trying to deprive, again, those nations from those vital resources, the way they were also being deprived as well, from those resources. Okay, so the German submarine was known back in this time as U-boats, just because the German word for submarine was just way too long. It was like 20 letters long or something like that. It was just too hard to pronounce, that people simply abbreviated the word as a U-boat. The German U-boats, they were called the German submarines. That is to say, they're mostly affecting American cargo ships. Okay, American cargo ships are the mostly affected, again, in this unrestricted submarine warfare that Germany is carrying out. And again, those are American merchants taking things like food or grain, etc., materials of every kind. And as they approach the British Isles, they're going to be sunk again by the U-boats. Again, they're very hard to notice because they're underwater, and there was no way they could actually avert their ships from the submarines. The submarines have radars, and they were just identified and they were sunk. So the situation got to, again, a state of tension between the United States and Germany. Of course, the United States is actually sending letters of protest to the German emperor, to the German leadership, indicating that, again, the United States was a neutral country, that it was not, again, taking sides necessarily. It was just carrying out trade. Again, that neutral nations have the right to trade with any nation. That is, this is the right of neutral countries. It's called free trade, if you will. So those particular principles were at stake. They're violating neutrality, you're violating rules of free trade, and you're affecting, of course, interests. There's a loss of property, massive loss of property, and also lives as well. It's not just property, but also Americans are dying, civilians in many cases. Okay, and this situation, of course, escalated to the point that by 1915, the Germans sunk also a civilian ship. It was a cruise liner. There was there was actually tourists in the ship. 1,200 tourists were there, in a ship called the Lusitania. Again, this was a tourist ship. When you take a cruise, for example, a cruise ship, you go to the Caribbean, etc. You travel. There's partying, there's dinners, there's dances, etc. People taking a cruise. It's called the Lusitania, and as the Lusitania was around the British waters nearby, actually Ireland, by the way, it will be sunk by the German U-boats. The German submarines sunk the ship. Like I said, they were not really asking any questions. They just saw the ship and sunk it. There was no questions asked. In other words, they were not even bothered as to ask who was actually there, etc. They sunk the ship, and 1,200 tourist civilians were actually killed. From those, 220 of them were actually Americans that were on board, and they also died, again, from the sinking of the Lusitania. So, of course, public opinion in the United States is now turning more and more decisively against Germany, because it's not just the country of Belgium that was invaded and occupied by the Germans, but also, of course, is affecting now American lives, American interest, and American neutrality as well, was also at stake. So diplomatic relationships were at a very down low again in between Germany and the United States, and this is going to lead to a diplomatic rupture, and of course a declaration of war, as we'll see in just a few moments. But even though public opinion in the United States is pretty much now convinced that there has to be some form of action, okay, decisive action against Germany to respond to German aggression, President Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, again, Woodrow Wilson, is not convinced that this is, enough, or this is the time, to actually get involved in a war. So he refuses to declare war on Germany. He's still convinced that he can, through diplomacy, convince the German leadership to change their policy. So he's still betting on diplomacy, negotiation, talks, etc. That maybe this is going to convince them that that what they're doing, again, this is a violation of neutrality and this is not convenient, etc. So he really wants to convince them, in other words. So he doesn't feel that military action is, at this point, that necessary. Of course, that position is going to change. Even Woodrow Wilson, the president, and his administration is going to reconsider this isolationism, this neutrality, that we shouldn't get involved in Europe at this point, because by 1917, the war is now tilting in favor more and more towards Germany. Germany is going to now, by 1917, get the upper hand when one of the members of the Allies, Russia, withdraws from the war. Okay, so this is extremely important. Russia, even though was very ill equipped in every possible way to fight in this war, Russia, has not modernized. Okay, it had begun to initiate modernization, beginning to actually develop some factories, some industries in Russia. But at this time, Russia does not have an industrial base, a massive industrial base. Again, this is not an industrial power per se, not yet. Russia is not on a par, with Germany. It's not on a par with Great Britain, for example. Okay, it's beginning to move in this direction. So it doesn't have the industrial economy that is going to help Russia, of course, fight a modern war. It doesn't have the technology that the Germans had. Okay, they don't have tanks, for example. They don't have the latest technologies, the weaponry that the Germans had. As a matter of fact, the Russians are still fighting, in horses, cavalry. Okay, imagine what a cavalry is going to do against the German tanks. Okay, so they're not in a position to fight a modern warfare. They don't have the economic system, the industrial production. They don't have the technology. This is not a nation that can compete with the leading modern nations of Europe. So it's not very well equipped. But the significance of Russia was that it was simply located to the east of Germany. And by bringing Russia to the alliance with France and Great Britain, it actually was going to actually divide the German army in half. The German army will never be unified, fighting a single party, a single front, because it will be fighting, again, the Russians in the east and in the West, it will be fighting France and Great Britain. So the German army will always be divided. In other words, that was the idea, again, of bringing Russia, again, to the alliance. So Russia is going to actually leave the alliance, in 1917, precisely because it was in no condition to be fighting this war, and Russia will be completely ridden with conflict and trouble, from within. Russian society is going to disintegrate, and this created, of course, the condition for internal revolution that is going to actually overthrow the emperor, again, of Russia. The Tsar Nicholas II will be actually overthrown through what is called a communist revolution in 1917. This is the first communist revolution, again, in history. It actually occurred in Russia initially, and it removed, the emperor. The emperor of Russia will be removed through this popular uprising. Again, that precisely was revolting against the Tsar as a result of the policies of the Tsar that created desperation, created hunger inside of Russia. And of course, by entering the war, it pretty much exacerbated all of the problems, again, that the Russian people were actually feeling, of course. And it just kind of created a fertile soil for any revolutionary movement, whatever the label, whatever the ideology was going to be. It just created a ripe soil for political upheaval. People are going to be so upset, again, that they were simply going to follow any group that promised them, of course, the basic essentials for human survival, like food, for example. Of course, the communists will be that group in this case. So again, Russia was totally, in shambles economically. Particularly, agricultural production was in sharp decline in Russia. The Tsar just wanted to build factories, industrialize, and move as many people away from the countryside to the cities so they can become, again, workers. And in this process, what's happened is that a lot of the Russian peasants are going to simply stop working the land, tilling the land, because they were trying to pursue jobs in the cities, etc. And of course, agricultural production is going to be in sharp decline. The Tsar is not going to take care of its own agricultural sector. It's not going to invest in technologies, for example, bringing tractors, fertilizers, to make sure that Russia will have sufficient food production in order to feed, of course, its own people, particularly the workers, again, in the industrial cities of Russia, of course. So that, of course, led to food riots. Okay, people are scrambling for food, particularly when the war breaks out. What the Tsar is actually doing is shifting whatever little food is available to the troops to feed the Russian forces. And so that deprived, actually, the cities of Russia from grain. And there is also, again, a scarcity of food products already in Russia. And of course, this leads to desperation. There's food riots. People are, raiding granaries, warehouses, trying to scramble for food. There's massive unrest in the cities of Russia. And of course, this created the perfect opportunity for any political group to rise up and promise, of course, what the Tsar was not providing. For example, food, something so simple. And of course, peace. There's also the desire in Russia to step out of the war, okay, to withdraw from the war. Okay, so this gave rise to what is called the Bolsheviks. This is the political group that were the communists, again, in Russia. The Bolsheviks that were taking advantage of this very precarious situation in Russia. The people were starving. They were, dying in the battlefield. Over 3 million Russian troops had been killed in the war from 1914 to 1917. There were about 1.5 million taken prisoners by the Germans. So it was a complete disaster again the Russian campaigns in the war. And once again, they were fighting a superior technological force, the Germans again. So there was no match. So of course, people desired also to withdraw from the war, and this is what the Bolsheviks, of course, promised. They promised bread and peace, something so simple. And of course, they were able to rally the people in order to actually, of course, bring about the imperial government of the Tsar Nicholas II. And of course, the leader of the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin, who had been exiled actually before the war broke out by the Tsar, was actually in Europe. And while he was actually promoting communism in Europe, he's going to be arrested in Germany, and he was imprisoned by the Germans, before the outbreak of the war in 1914. So when the German leadership learned that there's also, in Russia by 1917, a massive unrest, uprisings against the Tsar, and the Bolsheviks are the ones leading that, uprising. They released Vladimir Lenin, and it's simply called Lenin again, from their own prisons, and send them again to Russia in order to organize the uprising into a successful, if you will, overthrow of the Tsar. They says, well, this is going to simply accelerate the fall of the Tsar, and Russia will be out of the war. That's what we want. Of course, we want Russia to be out. So they pretty much released them, gave them a free ticket. They put them on a train, a free ticket to Russia. So now he's sent to Russia, and when he arrives to Russia, he organizes the Bolsheviks in a more cohesive way and overthrow the Tsar Nicholas II in 1917. And of course, he's going to, as he seized power, the Bolsheviks seize power from 1917 onwards, he's going to sign a peace treaty with Germany. He withdraws from the war. Russia is now out of the picture. Lenin is signing the peace treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans. And this was a very costly treaty for Russia, by the way. It was not for free. Lenin had to cede a significant amount of territory to Germany and Austria-Hungary. The region you see here in blue and red were territories that Russia controlled, but they were ceded to Germany and Austria-Hungary because by withdrawing from the war, the implication is that Russia has lost the war. And when somebody loses a war, when they withdraw, they call quits. In other words, they withdraw. There's losses involved, of course. So the Germans want to make sure that Russia is going to cede something to the Germans. They're the losing party, so they have to give Germany and Austria-Hungary some territory. They get a huge chunk of land. You see there, all Eastern Europe is given to the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. Okay, all this region you see here, by the way. Okay, so yeah, there is, of course, a sense in Germany that now they are going to become the leading party. There's, the war is shifting in their favor because now they have defeated one member of the alliance, of the rival alliance, Russia, and now they're going to turn all of their attention. All of their forces are going to be now moved, a great many of them, to the western front. They're going to be moved towards France to make sure that France falls, of course. So this was quite alarming. It made, again, Americans rethink that, well, now that Russia is out, France and Great Britain need an ally. In other words, they need assistance now, because otherwise they're gonna fall. That's for sure. So again, the fourth and final factor that involved the United States in the war is actually a telegram that a German minister, Zimmermann, sends to the country of Mexico in 1917. Okay, inviting Mexico to come into an alliance with Germany in order to fight the United States. Okay, so what this entailed, what this revealed, is that Germany was already planning, of course, of engaging the United States, and it was trying to build an alliance in America with countries that will be interested in joining the Central Powers to actually, of course, help Germany defeat the United States. Again, this is a telegram that was sent to the president of Mexico at this point, Venustiano Carranza, inviting again the president to join the alliance with Germany, something that President Carranza, of course, is going to turn down. Mexico is in the midst of a civil war itself. The so-called Mexican Revolution had turned into a bloody civil war, and Mexico is so unstable at this time, it's so fragmented that it cannot really join any alliance. And of course, Carranza is going to turn the telegram to the United States, by the way. Of course, the telegram was also intercepted, of course, by the British and the Americans. And of course, this was now the final straw that is going to finally, again, convince President Woodrow Wilson and the members of Congress to now decide to declare war on Germany. The Submarine telegram, again, was the final factor that convinced, again, the United States that this was now proper to do. Again, so there's now a declaration of war on Germany. Congress declares war in 1917. All right, so the United States is now going to come into the Great War. However, as the United States is going to come in on the side of France and Great Britain, President Woodrow Wilson announces almost immediately that the United States was not going to join the alliance. In other words, that we're going to assist the democracies. We're going to assist Great Britain, France, their democracies, to prevent the Germans from actually destroying democracy in Europe and winning the war. And so we're going to actually become involved. We're going to actually help them, send troops, and the like. But we're not going to sign an agreement, in other words, an alliance in which we're seeking, we're pursuing the same goals. We're going to be pursuing the same objectives as the French and the British are. Okay, we're coming on our own terms. In other words, this is what is called unilateralism. Unilateralism means that the United States was going to pursue its own objectives, its own goals, that were not going to be the ones pursued by the Europeans. The Europeans are pursuing, things like colonies, raw materials, and markets, etc. Again, more material, benefits, if you will. Okay, they're fighting for colonies, etc. All of that. So Wilson was an idealist. An idealist is somebody that has ideals. Again, so he's a product of the progressive era in the United States. He's a reformer, and so he believes in reform. He believes in that reform can create an ideal society. In other words, he believes that there's an ideal way of living. There's an ideal existence we can actually create for ourselves through reform. So again, he's a progressive. He's really right now, in the midst. He's the president again that is in the midst of the progressive movement, the progressive era. So likewise, he's going to project his progressivism, his idealism that we can create progress in Europe if we only bring about certain changes in the countries of Europe. Maybe this is the mission of the United States, trying to change Europeans, the way they do politics, etc. So this is a great opportunity. He said, this is a great opportunity to pretty much reform Europe in a more progressive way. So this unilateralism, in other words, that the United States was simply going on its own, pursuing its own ideals, its own objectives, is that the United States was not pursuing any territorial gains. In other words, yeah, we're going to participate, but not because we want to seize colonies from the defeated alliance, for example. We're not going to seize any territories from the war, again. And what really Wilson wanted to do is what he called bring peace to the world. In other words, he wanted to bring peace to Europe, create the conditions in Europe that will prevent war from occurring in the future. So he was an idealist. Again, what that means is that he really dreamed about this future. Again, that there was the possibility of changing people's attitudes, mindsets, and values in a way that you change the way they do politics, and instead of waging war, that they will, actually resolve their problems through diplomacy. Okay, he called again this war as the war to end all wars. This is the purpose. This is the meaning again of going into the war, is that if we're going to be fighting for something, is to create change in Europe, so we can actually end all wars in Europe, so they can stop fighting, in other words. So, of course, he's going to mobilize about 2 million troops, and they're going to now move into France. The vast majority are going to arrive to France to help the French and the British stop the Germans, who were now growing in numbers. Now that they're moving their forces away from Russia, they're being repositioned now in the Western Front. So the French and the British needed a strong ally again to stop the Germans, of course, from the West. So very, very quickly, Woodrow Wilson announced again a series of reforms. Okay, he called it the 14 points, Wilson's 14 points, in which he announces that this is what we're pursuing. In other words, this is a unilateral, pursuit. This is something that we're pursuing on our own. We're not really, forming an alliance with the French and the British to obtain material, objectives here, but rather, this is a list of 14 points, he said. This is 14 reforms, like the progressive era, again, reforms, again, we talked about, popular reform movement. So again, Wilson brings a series of reforms to the European leaders, saying that this is going to help you, the Europeans, build a more democratic system. That if you, create a more democratic system, you can actually, avoid many of the conflicts that you experience today. So I'm not going to go one by one. Again, this is just in a very, very general, understanding of what he was actually pursuing: freedom of the seas, that people will feel, the comfort to navigate around the world without the fear of being raided by pirates, for example, or by German U-boats, for example. Okay. Free trade, the idea that nations have the right to trade freely with each other, with no obstacles, for example, imposed by other nations. Self-determination, this independence. Self-determination is, again, what we need is that those societies that live under colonial rule, that they're colonies, that they need to be moving towards independence. They have the right to form their own nations, that is to say, because part of the reason why we have this war, he said, is because there's colonies, and the Europeans are fighting over colonies. So let us have those nations move towards nationhood. And secret treaties, like the treaties that they signed to pretty much incentivize participating in the war by saying, you can actually obtain some benefits if you join the alliance, for example. Okay, disarmament is also again part of the Wilson's 14 points. Stop the war without territorial losses. This is very important. Wilson actually offered a way out to the Europeans, that we can stop this war and nobody loses. In other words, nobody's going to lose an inch of land. Nobody's going to lose anything. Let's just stop the war. That was a great incentive, because what the Europeans actually feared the most is that anybody that calls quits and said, let's stop the war, that is an automatically statement of surrender and defeat. So nobody wanted to even, insinuate anything like that, because again, they were to be lose again territories, etc. So he said, no, I mean, you can actually sit at the peace table and stop the war without any territorial losses. And of course, he also wanted to create a forum for nations to discuss their problems, negotiate treaties, and of course solve their disputes. Called the League of Nations. It was like a international forum, if you will. Okay. Now at this time, of course, Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, who's now leading Russia, who's also facing a lot of problems, by the way, in Russia itself. He's not the absolute ruler here, but Lenin, he was now also trying to convince the Europeans that there was an alternative path for the future of Europe that he believed was going to also prevent wars from occurring. And that is, of course, he was proposing to the Europeans a more communist, of course, a communist solution, in other words, that he wanted to pretty much spread communism, turn countries to communism in Europe, because he believed that that was simply going to end the wars in Europe, the wars to, seize territories and raw materials and the like. So there's going to be two world leaders trying to influence events in Europe. One is Wilson, President of the United States, with his 14 points, and the other one is Lenin. Okay. All right. So the final defeat of Germany. So Germany will surrender, okay, in the very end, particularly when we move into 1918 again, despite the fact that Germany had won most of the battles. Okay, what we mean about the battles is just, as I explained, like Russia, of course, surrendered. It withdrew from the war, for example. Okay, Germany was the one that was actually moving across Europe, invading a series of countries. For example, Belgium. It was invading France, even though it did not really force the surrender of France. But the perception of the German people is that since they were never invaded, Germany was never invaded. There was never a foreign army marching through, a German town, etc. They never saw that, and they were the ones that were moving into different countries. So the perception is that Germany was winning the war. So that was the general perception in Germany, of course. So this is very important because this really convinced the Germans that they actually, in the end, as we'll see, that they actually won the war, but they was just so confused as to why it was otherwise, why actually the nation of Germany ended up, being losing the war. Okay, so here what we're going to see is that the German leaders, of course, felt incredibly pressured now that the United States is coming in to aid the French and the British, that are now bringing about 2 million soldiers. Of course, the German leaders are going to feel that they have more and more pressure, more homework to do, that this was not going to be an easy task to win the war anymore, because there was a strong ally now, coming in on the side of the French and the British to assist them. So that was, again, very important, that they're going to be feeling extremely pressured precisely in a time when the food supply is running so low, of course. And there's shortages, again, of food because of the naval blockade that Great Britain imposed in the northern ports of Germany. So now they're feeling the effects of that. They're feeling that we are going to lose the war because we're running out of food. There's now, massive unrest in Germany. There's something called the Revolution again of 1918 in Germany. It's something quite similar to what happened in Russia, even though this was not a massive, uprising or massive revolution that is going to end the rule of the emperor necessarily, but there was, of course, in the streets, there were people that were in riots, etc. There were strikes, labor strikes everywhere in the German industries, particularly the arms industry. The German arms industry are going to be very much affected, again, because the labor unions are on strike. What they want is for Germany to stop the war once and for all, because there's no food, for example. Okay, and so what they want is just to put an end to this, of course. And of course, many of the labor unions were known to be also, communist. So there were also a growing communist party inside of Germany that was also engaged in the massive unrest as well in Germany. So this added again to the fears again of the German leadership that if they did not really try to solve the situation of the war, then this party, this group, the communists were simply going to grow in numbers and more popular, just like in Russia. So they wanted to prevent that, in other words. So this is something that could have been prevented by in Russia if the Tsar Nicholas II would have simply just taken that decision himself, as opposed to the people pressuring him to do so and removing him from office, from the throne. So here the German leaders opted to end the war by appealing to one of the Wilson's 14 points. Wilson said, we can end the war once and for all without anybody losing any territory. Okay, so the German leaders said, oh, this is a good idea. Why don't we use Wilson's 14 points, his reforms, and say, we like this idea. Okay, let's place a pause, in other words, to the war. We're not surrendering. All we want is to sit at the peace table, end the war, and nobody's going to lose anything here. Again, this is a very, very good, of course, suggestion of President Wilson is a ceasefire. So Germany calls for an armistice. An armistice is a ceasefire. Okay, they call for an armistice, again, based on Wilson's 14 points. And there's great news, again, all over the world, in the United States, of course, the newspapers print. Germany asked for peace based on Wilson's 14 points. So this was great news that Woodrow Wilson was able to at least offer the Europeans a way out, okay, a solution to the war. And the nation of Germany, actually, accepted, that proposal. And that was really good news. And there was, a lot of people cheered. There were celebrations because precisely this was going to actually end the war once and for all. Of course, so there was going to be a meeting again of European leaders in the city of Paris and the Palace of Versailles. Again, they're going to actually come there and actually, sign the peace treaty. It's called the Treaty of Versailles, as it was called. And again, what the French demand is that they don't want to negotiate a peace treaty with delegates coming from the emperor, the German Emperor Wilhelm II. They want Germany to create a democratic government, almost like overnight, and send delegates to the peace treaty. Again, so Germany is now in the process of building overnight a parliamentary system, a new republic. The German Republic was called the Vemma Republic, in order to send a delegation to Paris to sign the peace treaty. But when the delegation of the Weimar Republic arrived, they found out that the peace treaty was not in their favor. This is not what it was promised, because in the peace treaty, it indicated that Germany and her allies had lost the war. Why? Because they called for a ceasefire. They said they called quits. So this is indication of surrender. So you just surrender. So what that means is you lost the war. So therefore, there's territorial loss. Again, Germany is going to lose 25,000 square miles of territories in Africa, okay, colonies in Africa, They're going to lose their Chinese treaty ports, the ports in China Strait. They lost it as well. And also they're going to lose the territories that they gained from the treaty with Russia, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. All of that territory I show you in the map, all of that will have to be given back. Again, not to Russia, but we're going to see the creation of new nations again from that land. So Germany is not in possession of that land anymore. And also there's, again, the Guild War Clause, in that Germany in the Treaty of Versailles was blamed for igniting World War I because they declare war first. It was Wilhelm II that rushed to declare war on Russia. And with that declaration, Germany will be blamed again for the entire war. So therefore, Germany needed to pay the Allies reparations. Every year, Germany needed to pay, monies amounting to $33 billion. Again, this is something, a monumental sum of money that will be paid in decades. The expectation is that this is, again, an obligation that Germany will have for decades to, again, destruction of property, lives in general, again, the ships they sunk, etc., the countries they invaded, $33 billion they have to repay. Okay, so this is the end of, again, World War I, but I want to just very quickly move into part 3 to talk about the outcomes. What are the outcomes of the Great War? So rather quickly here, the outcomes. What changed as a result of the Great War? So what, some of the most visible changes in Europe itself is the fall of the European monarchies. Okay, so the monarchical structures that go back many, many centuries into the past, those were really the remaining monarchies really still functioning in Europe, like the German monarchy, the Russian monarchy, the Austrian monarchy come to an end. Okay, the German, and Russian, and Austrian empires likewise, those imperial systems disintegrate because they ended up being on the losing side in the defeated alliance, or they were simply devastated, by the war itself. Also, the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire also comes to an end as well. Okay, so this is, a visible change that as the 20th century begins, we see the ending of long-standing political institutions like monarchy in Europe, that the expectation is that with the fall of those imperial systems and those monarchies, there were going to be now new structures built in their place. The expectation is that many of the colonies, many of the societies that lived under colonial rule in the German Empire, Austrian, Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire, that we're going to now move towards independence. Those were, societies that were divided along ethnic lines. There were many ethnicities that are now moving towards independence, self-determination. They were going to create their own independent nation states that is going to represent their particular ethnic group, representative form of governments, of course. So the rise of democratic states. Now, the expectation is that they were going to be fully democratic, but democracy has to be built over time. Democracy cannot be built overnight in a country that has no experience, no traditions, again, dealing with democratic procedures like elections, etc., governance, and the like. So again, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland were among the few of the countries that are going to now arise as independent nation states that are going to represent certain ethnicities, those ethnic groups in Europe, particularly here in Eastern Europe. We're going to see the formation again of new nations again in Europe, nations that were colonized in the past. Okay, but last but not least, point number 3 is one of the most important outcomes of the Great War were actually doubts, again, that the war had created, fostered in the minds of millions of people living in Europe and also in the United States and around the world about modernity. As the 20th century opened up, now we're moving into the modern age. The 20th century was going to be the century of modernity. The leading modern countries, like the Western European countries, the United States, were leading the way, showing the rest of the world that this is the way human society should live. You need to develop your economies, bring in, of course, a capitalist system, introducing private property, free enterprise, build a democratic political system, system of elections and the like. You need to trust technology, machines, modern science to solve problems in the world, because this is the way that human beings should live. This is the ideal existence, in other words, modernity. So again, they were promoting that idea around the world, and you need to modernize. You need to catch up again with the changes that other nations are creating. So when the World War, the First World War comes to an end in 1980, and we move into 1919, 1920, many people around the world are going to now have doubts about modernity, because they began to question the wisdom, for example, of modern science and technology. They said, well, we were told that modern science and technology were going to solve the problems that afflict us, that if we only trust our science and our technologies, that we were going to create this ideal existence, have our machines, do the work for us, and have our scientists discover the laws of nature and tell us how the universe works, and trying to master the universe, that humans were going to become the masters of the universe. But people are looking around and see that modern science and technology left Europe totally in shambles, completely destroyed. That modern science and technology can also bring about destruction as well. Okay, so this is again some of the doubts that people are having. Like maybe we're misusing knowledge. Maybe this technology is not going to bring this paradise, this ideal existence, because the machines that we created are now turning against us. They're destroying us. For example, look, at single battles in Europe left about 500,000 people dead on each side, like the Battle of the Marne, the Battle of Verdun, for example. 500,000 soldiers lay dead on each side in single battles. Those are single battles, by the way. This is not the entire war. In the Battle of the Somme, 300,000 British soldiers lay dead at the end of that particular battle. And again, there are 25 million soldiers laying dead at the end. Again, 25 million. Again, soldiers are killed after the war. And of course, this is the work of technology, because the new technologies, the innovation, again, in this equipment that was created, like tanks and, grenades, etc., machine guns, etc., that was, again, the technology that was used to bring about, again, this staggering amount of casualties in Europe. 25 million, of course, people laying dead. And on top of that, as we move into 1919, at the end of the war, there's going to be a world pandemic that affected virtually every country around the world. This was called the Influenza Pandemic. The influenza, it was called, that actually ended up killing about 20 million people in only a year and a half. 20 million again. And again, this added to the 25 million soldiers that lay dead in Europe. Now 20 million dying from influenza, of course, this pandemic. And that, of course, raised doubts as well among the people of the world in terms of the ability of modern science to actually deal with the problems of nature, deal with human epidemics, human diseases and epidemics that take a toll on human populations, let's say. So this is going to be also questioned. Is our science going to be dealing with the problems of the natural world? Can we develop a knowledge, a science that master nature, or is nature always in control and we're just in delusional to be thinking that we can control nature through our science, in other words? So again, those are the doubts of modernity. People are doubting, right, that maybe this science is not the answer to the problems, of course, because look at the pandemic. We couldn't control it. And of course, this is something that was corroborated, perhaps, or reasserted by the experience of the Titanic. And this ship that sunk in the early years of the 1900s is way before the outset of World War I. There was a ship, the largest ship ever created by humankind, indestructible vessel, built with the best materials, steel, etc., indestructible. This was the glorious achievement of modern science and technology, that in the very inauguration of the ship, as it was sailing around the world, it sunk. Again, it hit an iceberg, it sunk. And so that was also evidence that nature will always destroy our works, that we're powerless, we're vulnerable in the face of nature, that we can build anything we want. We can build the greatest cities, the greatest technologies, the greatest vessels, etc., and feel very much in control of the universe. But nature comes along and very quickly and easily can destroy us, in a heartbeat. So this is another, again, incident that led to a number of questionings. People are saying maybe this is not the way. This is not, modernity is not going to be the path of the future, because we're creating, of course, technologies that are destroying us, and they're vulnerable in the face of nature. Nature can just come in and destroy us. Okay, so those ideas, those doubts, were also raised by very brilliant thinkers, scientists that were living during this time. For example, Sigmund Freud. He's the father of psychoanalysis. He's considered the father of modern psychology, by the way. He's from Austria, and he is, of course, present during the First World War. He witnessed the destruction, the barbarism, and he was questioning, again, the wisdom of modernity, in that one of the, again, emphasis of modernity is the idea that human beings, if we develop ourselves intellectually, if we study, if we build knowledge, if we go to school and we learn science, for example, and we go to universities, earn degrees, and we develop our rational minds, that we can create, again, through our rational mind, a rational society that is going to be very well organized and very, very, orderly. Okay, that people are going to behave appropriately and the like, because they're highly educated. Through education and intellectual, rational development of our critical thinking skills and analytical skills, that this is the way people should live in order to be happy, in order to be truly happy, to treat each other with respect, live in a civilized manner. And so all we need to do is, create public education systems, universities, etc., educate the population, because this is the way, again, that people are going to create the ideal existence. But, this is what Europe was doing, by the way, for quite a while, investing in education and training people in science, technology, and trying to, build up literacy in the population, etc., become rational, in other words. But when Sigmund Freud, witnessed the war, and at the end of the war, he witnessed that the most rational societies in the planet, Europeans, behaved in a very irrational way. Okay, in a very irrational manner, that this was not the work of a rational mind. So he actually, through his research, discovered that human beings actually have another chamber in the mind that is called the subconscious mind. Again, that yes, we do have a rational mind. This is the mind that we use in our waking state, to solve problems, etc. But there's another part of our mind that is also, influencing our behaviors, called the subconscious mind. This is the part of us that store all memories, all past experiences. And when people have a very troublesome, very painful upbringing, okay, we store those experiences in the subconscious mind that makes us act in many cases very violently, of course, because subconsciously we're storing a lot of pain. We're repressing, okay, repressing a lot of emotions. So we talked about the alpha male, for example, okay, in Europe. So Europeans were always trained, educated to repress their emotions because you needed to be strong. You need to be a macho, okay? So if you ever felt pain, repress it, okay? Don't express it, repress it, etc. Because then you'll be showing weakness, for example, okay? So what Europeans were doing for many, many generations is simply repressing their emotions, their pain, their grief, their suffering in a way that what Sigmund Freud interprets here is that by 1914, all this repression came out in the form of aggression. Those were males that were very much repressed emotionally because they wanted to be so macho that they were simply unleashing their pain on one another in the form of aggression. And that's what aggression is. It's just simply the experience of pain, and you're trying to unleash your pain onto others, of course. So Sigmund Freud is doubting that maybe, rationality, that to be rational is the way of the future. You need to deal with your own mind. You need to heal your past. You need to heal your own subconscious mind so you can be free of pain in order to create a more peaceful, more happy society. Because otherwise, again, we're going to create barbarism, of course. And Albert Einstein, again, is another brilliant scientist that is also going to question, again, the wisdom of modernity, the ideas of Albert Einstein in terms of the theory of relativity. Where the theory of relativity entailed was simply the suggestion, Albert Einstein was suggesting again, that this world was not really material, okay? The world that we sense, that we feel, that is so secure, that is, composed of material objects, is really just bundles of energy, is just frozen light. In other words, that the world is made up of energy. And energy can be so dense that appears to us, to our senses, as material objects. Okay, so it's not really, again, a material universe, and that the laws of nature are not universal. That whatever you discover in this planet to work in a specific way, it is only a law that you have discovered here locally that might not even apply in some other parts of the universe. In other parts of the universe, there's different laws, there's different principles, and so the universe is just, again, is uncertain. There's no universal principles you can say, I have discovered a law that applies everywhere, all over the universe. Your experience of time, for example, how you experience time on Earth might not be, the same experience in another galaxy, in another planet, okay, in another part of the universe that perhaps there's no time, or time moves slower or much faster, etc. So the universe has so many different chambers, if you will, that operates in different sets of laws, that whatever is only knowledge that is here, understandable in this particular planet, very locally, but not in the entire universe. So the significance of this is that the ideas of Albert Einstein, the theory of relativity, brought uncertainty. Again, that there's nothing certain, there's nothing, something, that can make you feel so secure about our science, that our science is not going to have all the answers, because the answers of science only apply to this particular tiny speck of dust called planet Earth that is not applicable in different areas of the universe. That is to say, so there's uncertainty. The universe doesn't feel that secure anymore because it's all lights, it's all energy, and we're not going to arrive to a science that will enable us to understand the entire universe. So they created uncertainty that maybe our science, again, is not going to bring us all the answers to the problems of the world, that is to say. Okay, so with that, we conclude our topic on World War One. This is the end of World War One, and the questions are located at the very end of the document. After this, we're going to be moving into the next topic on the Great Depression. That will be the 6th topic of the semester. This is the end of World War One, and I'll see you then in session 1 of the Great Depression coming next.